My name is Susan McBride. I would like to welcome all of you with my coworker, Mike Edding. We will be presenting Getting the Most from Your Cast Iron Cookware, which is the next program in our Kitchen Tech series. We will be answering questions, but we would appreciate it if you could enter the questions into chat, and that way we can kind of answer them as we go along. So I'd like to start by talking a little bit about why cast iron. Cast iron is one of the oldest types of cookware. It's been around since the 6th century. Our grandmothers probably all cooked with cast iron. And in the past few years, cast iron has really had a comeback. What was once considered a dinosaur of cookware has really become more popular with all generations. And there's good reason why. And that's what we're going to hope to uncover in today's program. So let's start with the fact that cast iron can be an inexpensive or a low investment type of cookware. There's about a $25 entry point for a heavy piece of cookware, which is a lot less than today's more high-tech or shiny stainless steel cookware. They can be up to 10 times the cost of cast iron. With such a low price point, you can easily test out a cast iron pan, a skillet, for example, without really making a significant investment. And then you can decide if you would like to expand your collection to include more cast iron. But it's a pretty low cost option in terms of cooking. In addition, cast iron can be considered an heirloom pan in that it can last a very long time. With proper care, cast iron can really outlast any of us. And even with improper care, it can be rehabilitated, as Mike will discuss later in the program, and it can outlast us. It is something that you can hand down to your children and your grandchildren. And if you have your grandmother's or your mother's cast iron, pull it out, clean it up, season it properly, and by all means, start using it again. And Mike will be talking a little bit more about how to clean it up and season it if that needs to be done. So what makes cast iron so wonderful? Well, it's cooking properties primarily. Because cast iron is constructed from iron, and iron has a densely packed structure of atoms, it is very good at conducting heat. That means that pans heat evenly and transfers that heat to your food evenly, so your food will cook much more evenly than a thinner, more flimsy pan. You're not going to get hot spots or cold spots with cast iron. In addition, it retains its heat even after it's been removed from the heat. And that means that it's going to help keep your food warmer when you take it off the heat. So you can cook something in cast iron and then set it aside, and it's going to stay warm for a lot longer than if you use another type of cooking material. It cooks well at high temperatures. You can take cast iron heat and take it from the grill to the oven to an open fire. You can cook as high or as low as you need to. And what's great about it is once you've seasoned it properly, it's going to have this nonstick surface. And it doesn't matter how high you cook something, the nonstick surface is not going to be compromised. It's not going to be damaged, unlike other nonstick pans where you really have to maintain a proper temperature, and it's usually pretty low, no higher than 400, but even 350. And so it's a great option for cooking at really high temperatures. You can start something on top of the stovetop and then throw it into a searing hot oven, and it's not going to damage the pan at all. So it's got being able to cook at a high temperature is really one of the best qualities about cast iron. And then finally, it's versatile. You can cook many different ways, and I've listed a few here. You can saute on the stovetop. You can sear things at very high temperatures. You can braise things and cook them low and slow for hours. You can fry, whether it's shallow frying or even deep frying in a cast iron. You can bake, you can broil, as I mentioned before, you can throw it on the grill. You can cook out over an open fire if you're going to go camping, and you can switch between these and not have any fear of damaging the pan. You can really do just about anything with a piece of cast iron cookware. But cast iron can't do everything. So once your cast iron is properly seasoned, and what that means is that you've created a nonstick surface on the cast iron, you really want to avoid cooking acidic foods in it. And that would be something like a tomato sauce, a lemon sauce, a vinegar-based sauce, because the acids will break down that nonstick patina that you have developed over using the pan. And so you do want to avoid using acidic foods not because they will damage the pan, but because they will damage the nonstick surface that you've created by seasoning it. You also might want to avoid using foods that require a very precise cooking temperature and length of cooking. And I'm thinking of things like a delicate fish, where you really have to be careful not to overcook it, because cast iron maintains its heat. Cooking things that are more sensitive to the cooking time have the tendency to overcook in cast iron cookware. And so take something like aluminum foil or parchment paper for your delicate fish, or things that really you want a precise cooking time with, because neither one of those are going to transfer heat and hold on to the heat, and you will have less chance of overcooking your foods. Because you don't really want to use soap very often, if at all, on your cast iron when you're cleaning it, you might want to think twice about cooking foods that have really strong flavors or odors in the cast iron, because it can grab onto those flavors and odors and hold on to it, because you're not using soap to wash it off. Now, I have cooked salmon in my cast iron pan, and I haven't noticed an odor afterwards or any kind of flavor transfer, but it is something to be aware of if you maybe are just a little more careful about what you cook in it. And then lastly, until your cast iron is properly seasoned and has developed that nonstick patina, you probably want to avoid cooking sticky foods in it, because they are hard to clean out when they do stick. And you want to be careful with how you clean your pan. That may be something you want to avoid at the beginning. After you have seasoned your cast iron and created that nonstick surface, then you should be able to cook in your cast iron some of the more sticky foods that you might cook. But at the beginning, you may want to just avoid that altogether. So I want to talk a little bit about the different types of cast iron, because there are a couple of different varieties that you need to be aware of. And I want to make sure that we're on the same page when we're talking about cast iron. There are two main types of cast iron, and one is an uncoated cast iron pan, which is on the left. And that is pretty much what I've been talking about up until now. But you can also buy coated cast iron pans, and these are pans that have been coated in an enamel coating. They are beautiful, they are versatile, but the two types of cast iron are slightly different. So I want to talk about some of the similarities and then some of the differences between buying an uncoated cast iron as well as a coated cast iron. So let's start by looking at how they are the same. They are both heavy. They both are made out of cast iron, and they are both very heavy. And so if that's something that is an issue for you, then you may not want to consider cast iron. But it's the heaviness that contributes to its fabulous cooking properties. And so they also have the similar heating properties. They are slow to heat up. When you put them on the burner, you really want to give them time to completely heat up evenly throughout the pan, both of them. They conduct heat very well, so they're going to promote that even cooking, and the qualities of both of them are the same in that regard. They are similar to being oven safe, although you want to check the manufacturer's recommendations when you buy a coated pan. Some of the coated pans, particularly the less expensive coated pans, have a lower upper limit of heat. So in other words, some of them are safe at 500 degrees, some of them are safe up to 450 degrees, some of them may only be safe up to 400 degrees. With the enamel coating, you have to be a little bit more careful with the temperature that you're putting it into, because there are some issues where the enamel can crack or chip if they're put into too hot of an oven. And they can develop cracks that are so small that you don't really see them until they start chipping. So that is just something to be aware of. And then also, both of them are induction ready. So you can use either the cast iron or the coated cast iron on an induction oven. And then finally, they're both available in a very wide array of sizes and types of pans and skillets and braising Dutch ovens and things like that. So you're going to get a lot of variety. So how are they different? And I will walk you through this as best I can. But it is the differences that set them apart from one another. So let's go through how they are different. In terms of the nonstick qualities, once an uncoated cast iron has been seasoned, it does have better nonstick properties than the enamel coated pan. They become slicker every time you use them, the uncoated pans. So every time you're using an uncoated cast iron pan, it's going to become more and more nonstick with each use. The more you use them, the better they get. And while the coated pans are not quite as nonstick, they are easier to clean when food does stick to them, because you can wash them like you can any other type of cookware. You don't have to be careful with using soap to remove the patina or to get them wet and having them rust. The coating protects the iron from all those issues. And so you can load them up with soapy water and clean them, and it's not an issue at all. As Mike will discuss in his part of the program, you don't want to soak uncoated cast iron in water, but with the enamel coated cast iron, you can soak it. You can clean, as I said, you can clean it with soap. You can really scrub them and they're going to be fine. In addition, with the enamel pans, the ones that are coated, you don't need to avoid using acidic foods, because that enamel coating is protecting them. So there's no harm in washing off the coating that is on the pan. It's already coated with enamel and it's fine. You can also wash off odorous foods from the coated pan, so you don't have to avoid the smellier salmon foods and things like that. You also don't have to worry about seasoning the pans when they're coated with enamel. They are ready to use right away. But you do have to be more careful with the high temperatures, as I mentioned in the last slide. And you'll want to read your manufacturer's instructions to make sure that what the upper limits are. One benefit of the enamel pan is that they typically will have a light interior. Not all of them. Some of them have a dark interior. But if you can get one with a light interior, it's advantageous when you're cooking, because you can really see what you are cooking. You can see when your meat is browned, when you're searing meat. You can see when something is done cooking a lot easier than if it's got a dark interior. And so That's one great benefit of the coated enameled pans. And they come in really beautiful colors that can add a lot to your kitchen decor if you leave them sitting out. They're really lovely, nice pieces. Uncoated cast iron can be significantly less expensive than enameled pans. So, for example, the Lodge Classic 12-inch skillet retails for about $30, compared with Le Creuset Signature, approximately the same size skillet, which is $180. So it's 6 times more expensive when it's coated with enamel. Those are the two really most highly recommended brands. But you can't go wrong with other brands too. And an example would be Tramontina. It's a admirable skillet. It's enameled cast iron 10-inch skillet is only about $50 on Amazon. So it's a lot less expensive than Le Creuset. The difference would be that the enamel coating is probably a little thinner, and so it may chip more easily. It may sustain cracks faster than a Le Creuset or another higher end enameled pan, but it is certainly going to do the trick, and it would be a great place to start if you're interested in trying an enamel pan to see how that works for you. The last type of cast iron I'm going to talk about is kind of the cream of the crop. It is a polished cast iron. It's what I would call more of a boutique cast iron because it is so special. It's really an heirloom quality cookware, and it's not mass produced. And so that way there are fewer of them and they are more expensive to make. And it really is a true splurge if you want to go in this direction. The majority of cast iron, like the ones that I've been talking about up till now, are mass produced by pouring molten iron into a mold that's made out of sand. And then this mold creates a rough sandpaper-like surface, which is why you have to go through the seasoning process to try to get it to be smoother and more non-stick. One of the main differences between the various cast iron skillets on the market is whether or not this surface that is kind of pebbly when you first get it, when it first comes out of the mold, whether or not it has been smoothed out after casting. Smoother cooking surfaces like the one found in the picture here, which is a butter pat skillet, are more non-stick and they are easier to clean. These smooth cast iron skillets are generally a lot more expensive than their rougher counterparts because of the additional labor involved in the manufacturing process, but they are polished to a really smooth finish, and they're very, very nice pans. Some of them are also a little thinner and therefore a little lighter in weight. They may be pre-seasoned, but you still want to go ahead and go through the seasoning process when you get one of these polished cast irons, just to make sure that it is fully seasoned and ready to use. So as I mentioned earlier, it is significantly higher in price. So for example, the Butter Pat 12-inch polished skillet, compared with the $30 that a Lodge skillet would be, this skillet is going to be $345. So it's clearly a much higher price point. But if you know you love cast iron and it's something that you're going to have for generations to come, it might be an investment that you're willing to make. So I've talked a lot about what new cast iron is and how you would go about using it. But I'm going to turn it over now to Mike, who's going to talk a little bit more about vintage cast iron, older cast irons, and things to look for, and then how to care for your cast iron properly.
Thanks, Susan. As Susan mentioned, there are plenty of great options available for new cast iron nowadays, especially in terms of enameled and polished cast iron. Maybe more so now than at any time since aluminum cookware and then nonstick cookware took over from cast iron starting in the 1960s in terms of popularity. But I'm going to be talking about pre-owned cast iron for a few minutes. And generally speaking, the cast iron that I'm going to be discussing is not going to be enameled. It'll be uncoated solid metal, since that sort of style made up the large majority of cast iron produced in the 20th century. Personally, I find myself drawn to vintage cast iron rather than new cast iron, though I've purchased both. I should note that the word vintage, when it comes to cast iron, has a very specific meaning. It refers to cast iron that was made before 1957. After 1957, production techniques became more automated, and the resulting pieces became less collectible, but certainly not less usable. So on the next slide, I ask, why would you buy vintage? So why would you choose this over getting a new piece, since the new piece is more likely to be a sure thing? Well, first, vintage cast iron often has a smooth cooking surface with much less texture than modern lodge models, for example. In some cases, the pans made back then, before 1957, they're relatively lightweight compared to a similar sized model you might get today. As with any collectible, of course, it's fun to try to find bargains and spot rare pieces. There's that thrill of the hunt aspect to it, in other words. The cast iron made before 1957 was likely handmade, and that gives them some added feeling of history and significance. And I'd say, generally speaking, it can be a rewarding hobby if you're trying to find the perfect pieces or building a collection. So learning how to spot the notable brands and estimate their age can be fun. And the feeling of restoring something to its former glory is also a real thrill, if you can make that happen. So there's some vintage brands that you should be on the lookout for if you're shopping. So no disrespect to cast iron makers from other countries, but I'll only be discussing US manufacturers today. Our country really has this rich tradition of cast iron manufacturing that I'd like to delve into. So Lodge is the brand that we're all familiar with. They started making cookware in Tennessee in 1896 as the Blacklock Foundry. They converted their name to Lodge Manufacturing after a fire in the early 1900s. And a lot of the Lodge that you see at garage sales or what have you is not vintage, but with some research, you can learn to distinguish the new Lodge from the older Lodge. Another manufacturer that you want to be aware of is called Wagner. They're another famous US maker, which began in Sydney, Ohio in 1891. Wagner pieces are great. They seem to be slightly susceptible to warping as compared to some of the other manufacturers. And I'll show you how to test to see whether your pan is warped or not in just a few minutes. The most collectible Wagner pans that you might find just say Sydney O, so O for Ohio, under the main title. So that's how you know it's really collectible. But you can do your own research on this and find out more. But that's just one little tip. There's a maker called Griswold, which dates back even further to 1865 in Erie, Pennsylvania. I'd say Griswold is probably the most sought after of the vintage collectibles. They have excellent manufacturing quality. They have a beautiful logo that kind of you can see it there. It's kind of a round circle with an inscribed cross. And if you want to find a very, very collectible Griswold, you want to look for either those that say just Erie for Erie, Pennsylvania, instead of having a logo at all. Also, if you see the word Griswold in italics letters, that's also very collectible. But generally speaking, if you have a Griswold, you can't go wrong. Finally, the last brand I'll mention is called Burlington Stove and Range. They seem to be of equal quality to Wagner and Griswold, but they don't command as high a prices, and mainly that's because there's no fancy logo that is on Birmingham Stove and Range items. So you'll have to kind of investigate to see if it actually is one and what date it might have been made. On the next slide, I have a couple resources for you if you're trying to do your own research. The first is castironcollector.com. If you read through this website carefully, you can learn a great deal on what vintage something is, if it's a Wagner and you're trying to figure out exactly when it was made. There are little variations in typefaces and sizes of logos and that sort of thing. If you're also just getting started with vintage cast iron, I like the guide that I have listed here from southerncastiron.com. And we'll be sending out the slides to all the registrants, so you don't have to write down these URLs. But check that article out. It's really good in kind of talking about the general concept of vintage. So when it comes to vintage, one of the things you have to worry about is warping. And warping can dramatically affect the resale value of cast iron, as well as make it unusable in certain circumstances. And warping usually occurs as the result of thermal shock. And that's when the temperature of the pan is changed very rapidly, either to become very hot from a relatively cool state, or cool from a really hot state. If that happens very quickly, the pan may warp. So how can you check? The first thing you want to check for is whether it wobbles. So you put your cast iron pan on a flat surface and kind of try to move it back and forth as it's sitting on the surface. And if it rocks back and forth, your pan has the wobbles. And it's not great to have the wobbles, but many of them do to some extent or another. The other thing you can test for is whether it will spin. So lay it flat again on a surface and tap the handle sideways slightly to see if the handle will spin around and around. If it does, that means you have a spinner, which the bottom of the pan is lower than the rest of the pan, which allows it to spin. What you want is for it to resist that spinning, where the whole surface is in contact with the tabletop that you're laying it on. So that's the spinner. The wobble is when it rocks back and forth. So if you find that you have a spinner or a wobbling pan, they may still be usable in certain circumstances. So if you have a gas range, wobbles and spinners probably will work just fine, because the gas heat will be able to transfer to all parts of the pan, even if they're not directly in contact with the supporting mechanism. But if you have a glass-topped electric range, or you have an induction heating surface, you want to have better contact with the surface, and a wobble or a spinner probably won't give you great contact. But even if it's too warped to use on top of the stove with your induction heating or your glass top electric heating, you could use it for baking. A warped skillet can still make a fantastic cornbread, and a warped Dutch oven can be used for baking loaves of typical wheat bread very effectively. It won't be affected at all. So even if its value is lower on the resale market, you can still use it in other ways. So in the next section, I'm going to be talking about some of the common issues that people have with their cast iron surfaces and how to fix them. Now, you're going to hear me say a lot that the solution is stripping and reseasoning. And you could think of stripping down to bare metal and reseasoning as sort of a reset button on your cast iron. If you do this process, a lot of the cast iron problems that will come about will be resolved. So if all else fails, strip and reseason, and that will solve it. But we'll go into more detail here. So the first thing you might find is that your pan is more of a bronze color than a black color when coming from the factory. So this is perfectly normal. You don't need to worry if your pan looks brownish. That is kind of the way they are at first. So you should just use it like you normally would. You don't have to strip it down to try to get the black surface. It's going to come naturally just with regular use. Now, if your cast iron seems to have a blotchy surface or an uneven surface, it's probably because at some point somebody used too much oil in the seasoning process and it adhered to different parts of the pan in a different way. So this is not necessarily going to affect your cooking service negatively. If it doesn't seem to cause any problems, just keep cooking and it will become even over time. If you notice that food is sticking to parts of the pan, however, it's probably best to reseason the pan after you strip it down. So the next section, if your pan feels sticky to the touch, it's nearly always because you use too much oil or fat when seasoning. Ask me how I know this. I've done this. In most cases, you can just strip it and reseason it, and it'll be just fine. No harm done. A flaking surface happens when the seasoning that you've applied doesn't adhere to the iron very well. It simply chips away or flakes away as you use it. If you notice this happening, you're probably using an oil that didn't adhere very well. For example, a few years ago, flaxseed oil was recommended on all the blogs as the best seasoning oil because of certain properties it had. It turns out flaxseed oil does create a beautiful shine. It's like showroom ready if you season with flaxseed oil, but it doesn't last. It flakes off like this. So if you're thinking of like putting a piece on the wall for display, you might want to do flaxseed, but otherwise don't use it, I would say. So if flaking does happen, you'll have to strip the pan down and reseason it with a different oil. So the next flaw you're going to find is a rusty surface. Rust is a pretty common sight in cast iron, especially if you're looking at garage sales, thrift stores, you find some in your grandma's old barn or something. One of the most satisfying experiences you can have is to take a rusty piece and turn it into a usable piece. It can make such a dramatic difference with a little bit of effort. So long as the rust didn't eat too deeply into the surface of the cast iron, it will probably clean up just fine. The other thing to keep in mind, though, is that rust, if there's a lot of it, it can hide other flaws. So if you have hairline cracks in the pan, a lot of rust may hide that, and it's not until you remove the rust that you see the flaws that are actually there. So just after you're going through the process of removing the rust, make sure there's nothing more ominous underneath the surface that might render it useless for cooking. So I'll talk about removing rust in just a few minutes. So the next thing I'll talk about is pitted surfaces. Pitted surfaces can be the result of acidic food being cooked in the pan. Susan was talking about how that can cause damage to pans. If you're cooking like an Italian tomato sauce or something, if you do that all the time, it could have a problem. My mom, when she is making her like Sunday meal, her beef roast, she sometimes puts tomatoes in with that and lets it kind of slowly cook over time to braise. But I think over time, she says that she's noticed that she's getting pitting in the surface. And I think it's because of those tomatoes that she's using. So the pitted surface will have less value if you're trying to resell it, but it might work just fine for cooking. If it's well seasoned, the pitting, the food will still slide off of it sometimes, so it may not be a big deal. And if the pitting is underneath the surface, like on the bottom side of the pan, then it's not a big deal at all. It's just kind of unsightly. So you'll want to remove your rust if there's any on your pitted surface, and then strip and reseason the pieces before using them. So in the next section, I'll talk about prepping cast iron for seasoning. So you've already got cast iron that you've noticed has some issue or other, but you want to tackle it. You want to strip it down to the bare metal. So let's talk about how to do that. First of all, what will you need? You need some protective equipment. You need gloves and you need some eye protection. This is because the chemicals we'll be using, notably the Easy Off yellow top oven cleaner, if it gets in your eyes or on your skin, it could cause some problems, especially your eyes. You could really get some serious eye burns with this. So you need to be well protected. You need to have a sturdy trash bag in addition to the Easy Off oven cleaner. And you want, for the final sort of section, you want some Barkeeper's Friend metal cleaner. Don't use a cleaner with bleach, as you may end up creating toxic chlorine gas, and nobody wants that to have happen. So first, spray the cast iron thoroughly on all sides with oven cleaner and seal the bag up. So if there's excess oven cleaner dripping off of the pan, just let that drip into the bag and close it up and tie it tightly so no animals can get into it, or children, or that sort of thing. You need to place this bag in a warm environment. The chemical process won't take place unless it's warm. So room temperature, or even if it's a hot summer's day, having it outside on your driveway would be a great idea. So keep the cast iron in the sealed bag for a couple of days. And when you put your protective gear back on, open up the bag and scrub the cast iron to remove any released buildup. And then you'll respray and repeat the process as many times as is necessary to get down to the bare metal. I want to stress here that there is no danger to leaving the cast iron in the bag too long. You could leave it in there for 6 months and it will not damage the iron. So leave it in there. Don't be afraid to leave it in too long. Check it every few days. But once all the rust is gone, then use that Barkeeper's Friend to do a final cleaning. You'll rinse the pan or the Dutch oven or whatever you're seasoning or you're hoping to season, and dry it thoroughly, then season it immediately to protect it from rust. If the stripping process leaves rust behind, I'll show you how to remove that in this section. So unlike Easy Off, the process I'm going to describe can damage your pieces if you leave them unattended for too long. So you have to check on your cast iron every 30 minutes while using this process, or else you'll get possibly some damage to the cast iron. And the general idea here is you're taking a 50-50 mixture of vinegar and water and soaking the pan in this mixture. So soak it for 30 minutes, check it after 30 minutes, scrub it, and soak for another 30 minutes, and repeat until all the rust is gone. And you'll definitely be seeing some results after a couple of cycles of this. You keep going until the rust is gone, and then dry the pan thoroughly and season it immediately to avoid new rust from forming. Quickly after you get the pan out and you dry it off, if you're not super fast in seasoning it, you'll get something called flash rust, which it will immediately oxidize and put just a very fine layer of rust on it. And you can usually wipe that off and get it seasoned. So don't be alarmed by the flash rust. Okay, so let's talk about seasoning now that we've got all the rust off and some of the defects off. So seasoning is one of the critical skills that you'll need to develop for cast iron owners. And essentially, there are two types of seasoning. There's the initial seasoning, and then there's the standard seasoning. So the initial seasoning would be if you buy your pre-seasoned lodge from the store, that's already got a layer of seasoning on it. And if that's already been pre-seasoned, you don't have to do this initial seasoning. If it's more of like you've done the stripping and now you want to reseason it, there's a standard seasoning process. And I'll talk about them both. But what is seasoning? Seasoning is really a process where heated oil or fat forms a long-lasting polymerized bond onto the surface of the cast iron. So this surface, this polymer surface, will repel water. In the diagram here, I have the water as demonstrated by little blue circles. They hover over the surface of the pan in this diagram and in real life because there's a polymerized water repelling surface that keeps your food from sticking. It does make a very slick surface for cooking, but you'll still always need to use at least a little fat or oil when you're cooking in cast iron. It just a little bit usually does the trick, but you don't have to use loads and loads like you would have to in maybe an aluminum pan or a stainless steel pan. So what materials do you need to have on hand to do a proper seasoning? Fortunately, the answer is not much. You need a roll of lint-free cloths like Scott shop towels, a seasoning oil, and an oven. That's all you need. So what seasoning oil should you use? Some people will say just use whatever you have in the cupboard. And as long as the smoke point is high enough, this advice can work well. The oil I've seen most frequently recommended is grapeseed oil, and this has a smoke point of 420 degrees. You want a higher smoke point if at all possible. Crisco brand vegetable shortening is also an excellent choice for seasoning your cast iron. I definitely say you have to get the Crisco brand, as other shortenings may have lower smoke points and not be as effective. Crisco is also a little easier to apply possibly than liquid oils because you can get a scoop of it out and control the portion size pretty easily. Avocado and canola oils are also good options, and canola is definitely the best inexpensive choice that you can have. It has a relatively high smoke point, but I've used avocado as well, and it works great. Animal fats like bacon grease, beef tallow, and leaf lard will work, but they have a greater risk of going rancid. My mom, for example, always seasoned her cast iron skillet with bacon grease, and it worked great since she was cooking with this skillet every week. If she only cooked on it like once or twice a year, that bacon grease, that beef tallow in there is going to go rancid and you're going to have a problem. So I talked about the two general types of seasoning that we would have: initial seasoning and standard seasoning. So for the initial seasoning, this is if you are working with a piece of bare metal. So you heat your oven with the pan in it to 200 degrees. You apply a thin layer of oil or fat to the 200-degree pan, and you're going to want to kind of move it all around to fill all the nooks and crannies in the surface and on the sides of the pan. So you can use that shop towel to help get the sides as well. Some people clean the whole pan, not just the surface, but the sides, the exterior sides, and the bottom sometimes. You'll want to heat the pan with that thin layer of oil on it in the oven, which you've increased the heat to about 350 degrees. You want to buff the surface with a lint-free cloth to remove the extra oil, and then store that in a dry place immediately. So put the oil on, remove the excess, and put it away. With standard seasoning, this would be after you've used it for a while and you simply want to update the seasoning to make sure it's adequate. Or if you've already gotten a pre-seasoned pan, you want to put the first real layer of seasoning on it, you can use this process. So you need to first learn the smoke point of your chosen oil or fat. So if you're choosing like avocado or canola or Peanut oil, maybe peanut has a little bit of a flavor it could impart, so you might want to avoid that. Or the Crisco, you're going to learn that smoke point, and you want to preheat your oven to the smoke point. And once you hit the smoke point of the oil, put the cookware in the oven for an hour and use a lint-free cloth to remove any excess oil. So instead of just 350 degrees in our initial seasoning, you're going to want to heat it higher to your smoke point. And if you're not sure what the smoke point is, you can simply enter into Google sunflower seed oil smoke point, and it will tell you whatever kind of oil you're using. So you repeat that process of adding the oil, baking for an hour, and removing the excess oil after it's baked until you get a satisfactory finish. Usually, three cycles of seasoning will be adequate to prepare the cast iron for use. Naturally, just through cooking, you'll add on to that seasoning layer by layer as you cook in it. That will increase the surface layer by layer by layer. When you're done seasoning, simply allow the piece to cool, then store it away in a cool, dry place. It's not that difficult, it's just a little time consuming. So the final section, after you've learned how to season it, is how to care for it going forward. There's a broad spectrum of cleaning options available, from quite gentle to very abrasive, and it's probably best to use the least abrasive means possible to remove cooking residue after you're finished with your meal. So at the left, you can see that warm water and a sponge can go a long way towards cleaning a pan. This really may be all it takes to get it clean. And yes, it's okay to use a little bit of Dawn dishwashing liquid to clean out the pan with your water and sponge if you want to. That won't affect the polymerized liquid or the polymerized surface of the pan, but you definitely don't want to soak your pan in water, or especially dishwashing water, because that will eat into your seasoned surface. So a little bit is okay when you're wiping it down. Rinse it off and dry it immediately. Sometimes you need to have something to help you scrape off some of the residue. If you look in the center column, you'll see some options. So sometimes I use a purpose-made pan scraper like the red one that you can see on the top in the middle column. This one is made by Lodge. Other companies make them. I also like to use a wooden spatula with a flat bottom. You can see those on the center of the screen. That longer handle lets me apply some leverage to my scraping. It also lets me scrape while the pan is still kind of hot, whereas with the Lodge pan scraper, you have to get right up close to the surface to do your scraping. So the handle gives you a little protection from the heat. And when at all possible, I simply use some coarse kosher salt and a towel to scour that surface in a circular motion. I do this more than any other method, and often that will do all I need. So I'll just remove the crusted on food. This won't work if you are trying to cook a caramel in the or other sticky food like Susan was mentioning, but for most food, kosher salt and a towel will do the trick. So if you have even more stubborn food stuck on there, you can try to use steel wool or a chainmail cast iron cleaner to aid in your scrubbing. I would try the coarse salt method first. Don't go straight to stainless steel chainmail cast iron cleaners or the steel wool. Seasoned surfaces are not that fragile, but I think it makes some sense to use the least abrasive method as possible. I've got the little cast iron chainmail cleaner that I have used at times, but that doesn't happen very often. So after each use, For routine care, you'll want to clean and dry the pan. After drying, you want to apply a very thin layer of oil to the pan and heat it on your stovetop on low for just a few minutes. That will sort of get the oil to set in and fill in any imperfections that have been exposed while you've been cleaning it with your salt or your chainmail or your whatever. And as always, you have to remove the excess oil with a cloth and store it in a dry place. Don't just leave it sitting there thinking you're adding additional protection. It doesn't really work that way. You can stack your cast iron, but if you do, you have to make sure it's 100% dry before you stack. Some people will put like a paper towel between each layer of their cast iron to keep rust from forming. That's what you're trying to avoid, is those stacked cast iron situations where rust can get underneath there and form without you even knowing. So that's really all there is to the routine maintenance. Susan and I have both talked about a lot of information. So if there are any questions, you can certainly enter them into the chat and we'll try to do our best to answer them.